So, thanks again. That's a time for relaxation. In 1 hour, we'll be in Engedi. So we have future.
And 1.5 hours will be.
1 hour, Mira. After a day and a half of a joint marvel at the extreme nature that is manifested here at the Dead Sea, I would kindly ask you to turn your gaze toward the human layer, the people who chose to make the Dead Sea their residence. More accurately, the people who lived in this very place in an amazingly organized society, and through a period of several centuries had left its mark on each and every one of us here today. The historical finding carries great and many evidences to unique communities from around the globe that have gathered around the very understandable need for survival. It goes without saying that the very life in such a distinctly harsh habitat leads to communal living as a default, as the individual would find great difficulty in fulfilling all their needs without the excess strength and resilience of the collective. In this setting, the community of the Dead Sea dwellers of the 2nd century BC shines in its uniqueness and distinction from other known communities that have gathered just for the need for economical existence or distinct, intimate theological worship. This community has left behind a rich written finding within which resound familiar and ancient texts we recognize, such as most of the biblical and prophetic books. A fact that shows the close proximity, even kinship, to the families in charge of the holiness of most of the lifespan of the temples in Jerusalem. In my eyes, however, the most fascinating texts among these are those unfamiliar to us from the Bible. From their context, one can learn the mindset that they originated right here in the Dead Sea, and that provide primary source evidence to the nature of the thought that moved this community. Well, an inspection of these reveals a community in a transitional period and in a turbulent shift of fate that in part might contradict the spirit of the ancient text, which the members of the community were very well acquainted. I'm talking about the ancient texts. Such a transitional period may have been forced as a result of external political affairs at the time, if we recall the entrance of the Greek Seleucid king around 176 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes, and the shift of worship around 168 BC. The event of the Hellenistic spirit, that's the Antiochus, that's the Seleucid Empire, and this is the Hellenistic spirit that entered Jerusalem. The event of the Hellenistic spirit entering Jerusalem was immensely traumatic to the priestly class and naturally prompted an attempt to establish alternative similar worship in a different location, as simple as that, relocating the worship and carrying on. We can learn, for example, at the temple erected by the last of the Zadok lineage around the year 170 BC in Heliopolis, Egypt, a parallel active temple known as the Temple of Onias, Honyo. As mentioned, creating a temple replica is the natural and expected reaction. But here in the Dead Sea, however, we witness totally different reaction. In contrast, that transitional period gave birth to two unprecedented shifts in thought of society and theology that, in my belief, imprinted and rewired the consciousness of the entire Western world since. Two shifts, one of which relating to the other and originating from it. Here in the Dead Sea, two extraordinary paradigms were born in view of the history of ideas thus far. The first, manifesting itself in what is called the sectarian scrolls. Just brackets, sectarian scrolls, we call it this way. We call it sectarian, and then it leads to marginal group, and then it leads to unrelevant group, to the mainstream of thought. And that's where the research about the scrolls was for 60 years around. Sectarian group, marginal. We don't connect them directly to us today. So that's sectarian. They call it sectarian scrolls. And more specifically, in the community scroll role, community rules scroll. By the way, you see these pictures, that's how they looked. You know, that's not the community role. It's maybe Pesher Chavakuk, but they found it a scroll like this, in jars like this, in Qumran, also in Qumran. So I'm talking about the two shifts in thought. The first is the establishment of a community that is collaborative in all aspects of life and stands on the principle of equality, starting from the terms of acceptance into the community that is open to anyone, through the candidacy period, to sharing personal property and equity, to sharing personal debts, to sharing ways of life, and up to what we recognize today as the use of the crowd's wisdom in pooling their learning ability, research and study. That was a learning community, a researching and learning community. The two important keywords with a large amount of repetition in the sectarian scrolls defining the nature of this community were yachad, i.e. in Hebrew, together or togetherness, which is the very way that the group was called in its inner discourse, and the word maskil, enlightened, intelligent, which mainly attests to the desired character of the typical member of this community. It's just, just by counting the amount of repetition of these two words in all the sectarian scrolls. In fact, the only hierarchy that the group agreed upon was symbolic, and only in relation to the place of sitting in the study room, and in relation to the members' proficiency and literacy. It just said clearly, Ish lifnei re'eu lefi sichlo v'ma'asav. They sit one before the other according to his wit and practical deeds. The second substantial shift that is practically depending on the existence of such cooperative community is the shift from a central worship-based religion through a small distinct group of privileged few to a language-based theology. More distinctively, a community that made its goals the very research, study, and discussion revolving the will of God in the world as depicted in the existing text. All this through what is called in some of the sectarian scrolls the act of Midrash HaTorah. You see, that's how it appears there. Midrash HaTorah appears few times, not only in the community role, also in Damascus letter, etc. And it's not just symbolic anecdote, this appearance. It's very fundamental shift. An act, what's Midrash HaTorah? An act in which members of the community gather to study jointly and demanding the will of God out of the ancient text in a structure assigned for said purpose, as I believe Guy maybe showed you in Masada, the place where they sit and learn. And for spoken prayers meant to replace the central animal sacrifice of the ancient, of the temple in Jerusalem. A drastic change in the theological mindset that led for 1,000 years up until then, at least. The shift from a distant divinity, only seen through those in charge of worship, those who had to be carefully approached 3 times every year with offering of the first fruit of one's material labor. The shift from demanding God via the priest enjoying the divine favor towards personal responsibility to interpret God's will. No more the biblical lidrosh Elohim, to demand God, through an appointed expert, the Kohen, but Midrash HaTorah, demanding God myself from the text. We are witnessing diverging theological movement that at the same time creates unprecedented secularization. Unprecedented secularization, a new theology that emerged from secularization of the previous sacred worship. Here, we witness a secularization that rejects all the intermediating links between the man and his God and replaces them with a language, that magical substance available to any person and lives in the mouths of us all, including those who were not born close to the priestly family with access to the library of sacred text. The vertical demanding of God through the family of intermediating priests had been replaced by a horizontal demanding of text. That is, on its own, the text, an intermediator between man and the divine. This text, too, is left to the human interpretation, while developing practices of study via dialogue and in a group. Not by the authority of the big wise guy or the priest that by the lineage of legacy got the authority. And here's the crucial importance of belonging to a solid community, i.e. these people did not play with communal life just like marginal groups that we all know from the 60s. These people used the communal cooperative society as a vehicle to materialize an egalitarian and just society that suits the prophet's morality, no less. Both in Qumran, at the north of the Dead Sea, and here above us in Masada, where you've just been, one can witness an evidence for a literate group that had assigned designated buildings for writing and learning as the main axis of the community. The subject of purity and baptizing, that in the time of the temple had been a primary signifier for the priestly work, wherever it came in contact with the ritualistic holiness, that purity had been expanded here to purification before studying and coming in contact with the text, as is testified by the great quantity of water storage facilities here, mikvahs, and as testified by the written text found. This cooperative mindset, along with the values of sharing and equality, was born 2,000 years ahead of the first cooperative founded in England in 1844. No, this is the regulation of the International Cooperative Alliance of 2019. You can see all these 7 principles, they appear in Qumran 2,200 years ago. You know, the formal cooperative mindset. This thought has expanded up until our time and now covers more than 12% of humanity. 1 billion people in our world today are linked in one way or another to a certain cooperative. Even Zionism started with cooperatives, the practical Zionism. This very language theology, the other shift, which challenged the authoritarian vertical power structures, gave birth to rabbinical Judaism in time, 200 years after the people of Qumran started the rabbinical Judaism, as we recognize with Yochanan ben Zakkai. 200 years later, it changed, it gave birth to Christianity and to Islam. And talking history of ideas, it also gave birth to the social network perception. So, I'm finishing now. Whenever you think of the Dead Sea, please pay attention to these 2 revolutionary movements born within it. The cooperative community and the language theology that were born here 2,200 years ago, and now just as relevant. I thank you. And if anybody has a remark or question.
I just want to make a comment that these days we talk a lot about sustainable development and equitable societal development. Looks like these ideas were already there in this. That's what I'm getting.
That's the shift. That's the amazing shift. And, you know, by the way, I was amazed by your remark in your lecture yesterday that connected inequality to climate change and neoliberalism that we are all suffering these days from. So they thought this way.